driving meaningful impact. Sopra Steria Next.
Hello. In just 1 month between the 7th of February and the 11th of March this year, Martin Lewis Money Saving Expert website announced that it had processed 1 million complaints relating to discretionary commission agreements on car finance. Undoubtedly, car finance firms will have received considerably more complaints than this. They face a huge challenge in dealing with those complaints, though precisely what that means is not yet clear. So, how do you prepare for the uncertain road ahead? I'm Giles Colborne, Strategy Director at Sopra Steria Next, and I'm joined today by several experts who'll try and shed light on the challenge and offer some practical advice. David Tomlinson is a consulting manager at Sopra Steria Next, who specialises in complaints and remediation services. Darren Castle is a regulatory conduct advisor from Grant Thornton with extensive experience advising the motor industry. Amanda Payne is an experienced strategy director from CX Partners, helping firms create digital services for their customers. And Gary Craven heads up data consulting for Sopra Steria Next, helping firms untangle knotty data problems. Welcome, everyone. Before I ask you to untangle this problem, then, a couple of housekeeping points. First of all, we're recording this session, so we'll be emailing everyone who's listened live today with details of where you can find that recording. Second, we welcome your questions. You can click on the Slido link in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen and ask a question. The option is there to keep questions anonymous. And finally, if you prefer, you can turn on subtitles using the closed caption button in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. So let's begin with that question about what are DCAs? David, can you explain what is a DCA?
Certainly, thanks, Giles. So what is a DCA? First of all, just to be clear, DCA stands for discretionary commission arrangement. So important to start by saying they were banned in 2021 by the FCA due to concerns over the transparency and fairness of how they were being applied. So I'm sure many of us will know from personal experience a huge majority of new cars, are bought on some sort of finance deal in the UK. So generally, a car dealership or a broker would arrange that loan for the customer, and then a lender, for example, a bank, would provide financing on that deal. So it's estimated about 95% of those car finance deals have a form of commission model for the broker, so they can earn money from making a sale. So what was happening prior to January 21 was some lenders were allowing brokers to adjust the interest rates they offered customers for car finance. So ultimately, broker gets more commission for charging the customer at a higher rate. Again, important to say, this is in relation to personal car finance, so doesn't relate to commercial vehicles. So whilst banned, there have been complaints made to the Financial Ombudsman Service, which has sparked a whole heap of activity. So the practice of DCAs is being investigated as we speak. The FCA looking at a time period of 2007 to 2021. So a decent chunk of time, lots to sift through, lots of data to collect and analyse, and potentially lots of preparation for firms to undertake to ensure they're ready to deal with whatever comes. So that is what they are, that's how they were used, and it's why we're talking about them today.
Thanks so much. And Darren, it's a little more complicated than just the FCA being involved. I mean, how do what's the interplay here between the courts and the FCA and the Financial Ombudsman Service?
Remember to take myself off mute. So yeah, you're right, Giles. Thanks for highlighting that point. I think the FCA, when it made its announcement in January, set out a pause of the complaint handling timeframes to give industry and frankly consumers a little bit more certainty that complaints, if they do need to be resolved, are resolved in a consistent and fair way. So that's one of the main reasons why the FCA stepped in. It instigated a skilled person review across approximately 10 finance providers, where it is gathering huge volumes of data from sample of customer DCA arrangements across the period that David mentioned, and has obviously got a lot of analysis to do once that data is received. It has set out an intention to update everyone in September, but the courts are a reason why that is potentially that threat. But there are three that we know of, three Court of Appeal cases that are going through. We understood that there were potentially initial hearings for those around about now, and obviously the announcement a couple of months ago that Barclays had instigated a judicial review in terms of one of the two financial ombudsman decisions that were issued in January. So the FCA and in fact FOS have come out and highlighted the fact that those court hearings and the findings and the decisions that come out of those processes will be important, and will feed into its thinking in terms of how this will play out both from an FCA and a FOS perspective moving forward.
So that creates a little bit of uncertainty in the timeline. The FCA have said we'll say something by the 24th of September, but exactly what that is depends on whether the court has made a decision, made that public, or whether that case is ongoing. Is that right?
That's right, Giles. And I think you know, I've been involved in lots of conversations with lots of different parties in the industry. I think it would be fair to say that the majority now expect there to be a delay in terms of the FCA being able to report on its final decision and its requirements moving forward. It's not impossible, you know, if everything aligns in time, if the courts get to their final decisions, then it's still possible that the FCA may be able to provide some detail come September. But history tells us that these sort of court cases are invariably take a bit longer than we perhaps expect. And I think a lot of the market commentary and a lot of the opinion that I've heard over the last couple of months suggests that we're more than likely going to be looking at a holding response from the FCA in September, and then decisions becoming clearer in the new year.
Thanks very much. So sometime between September and the new year, we'll have a little more certainty. But I wonder, what are the possible outcomes of this? I mean, what are the outcomes that we can expect, David?
Thanks, Charles. Yeah, so we've looked at this, you know, a bit, and we think this it's likely to go one of three ways. So the first way is that the FCA can declare that there's no systemic problem, no need for any sort of remediation or redress or anything like that. But ultimately, if that happens, firms are still going to be facing a huge backlog of complaints to work through. They'll be given time to do that, but still a real challenge to sort of work through. And there may be a case, you know, I'll just close all of these complaints down, but there's almost certainly going to be nuances in individual complaints that are going to need review, management by exception, all that kind of stuff. The second option is almost quite the opposite, and that's that the FCA say, you know, there's a sort of blanket problem with a need to address all of these in not a one size fits all way. Obviously there'll be nuance, but you know, a more of a blanket approach. But again, unlikely, but possibly the easiest way to handle operationally in terms of treatment strategies and things like that. But the third option, something in the middle, which is often how these things tend to go, with a situation where the FCA takes into consideration, you know, the court's decision, as we've just spoken about, looks at their own analysis and their decision making, and then develops some criteria to provide guidance on what needs to be done, how to address it, whether that's, you know, handling complaints and working through the backlog, redress, or anything else.
So at a minimum, there's going to be a backlog of complaints which will have built up over almost a year, and will have been fueled by a lot of the stories in the press, I imagine, and probably the outcome is going to be rather complicated, where there's some specific conditions that need to be met. Is that a reasonable expectation for people to have, Darren?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the more I speak to different parties on this, the more nuances there are. within each of these arrangements and each of these deals with customers. I think, you know, there's a lot of the conversations in the background, some of the stuff that will no doubt be part of the judicial review. It's not just as simple as, you know, the broker had discretion to, you know, move the dial and charge X, and therefore that's unfair and all of it should be given back. There's lots of other factors at play here, such as the availability of alternative credit to that individual, you know, whether it's reasonable, and frankly most of the market unsurprisingly thinks it's not, that everyone should have been given the equivalent of a zero commission type arrangement. So I think there's a lot to still analyse and work through, both from FOS, FCA and the courts. And I think most people are expecting there to be something that comes out of the back of this, but that some of the early media commentary of this being the next PPI and it being, you know, tens of billions of pounds of redress, I think more people are saying that's some way off the mark than perhaps some of those media commentators up front.
And presumably everyone in the industry is keen to avoid that situation. So I wonder what we can learn then from past complaints and remediation exercises, and I wonder what good looks like. So clearly, whichever of those three outcomes we face, there's going to be an impact on business and an impact on day-to-day operations. David, how can we minimise that impact?
If we look at what's happened in the past and what I've seen in the past in remediation and complaints activities, is that a lot of the stuff I've been involved in has been very much bums on seats, large contact centres full of individual agents handling individual cases. All cases tend to go through a very similar route. So you've got your complex, you've got your more straightforward, but ultimately same treatment and the same often unnecessary journey for customers. So what's wrong with that? Okay, so it's inherently expensive for firms to deal with. There's a lot of manual processes. Granted, some of that is quite necessary with a lot of the investigation that has to go on. But in my experience, there's not a lot of innovation, not a lot of automation, not a lot of self-service. And for customers, that means more work for them to do, more uncertainty, longer wait times to get their money, get a resolution, whatever it is that they need. And then also that wait time just drives further chasing calls back into an already pressured and busy contact centre. So if we learn from that, what can we do to improve? So I think there's a better way ultimately. And with the FCA wanting, as Darren sort of alluded to, wanting to avoid another PPI and a drawn out process, I think it's good to be thinking about how we build processes with less friction that are easier and fairer for customers. And if we think about the players in this as well, I think what I'd like to do is reduce the impact of the claims management companies. So ultimately, they have a big part to play and a big impact on these operations. So, and ultimately, they exist because people may be anxious about getting things right. They feel like claims companies might be a safe pair of hands in what is unfamiliar territory, but they take huge commissions. They flood contact channels with requests. It can be often quite speculative. And for me, the answer to that is, as I've already said, making journeys as simple and accessible as possible. And to back that up, we've got to let customers know that we have simple and accessible processes. And I think that is a win for both parties.
So we're not in the sort of early 2000s and the era of PPI. We're in an age when everyone has access to a smartphone. People's expectations of these sorts of services feel very different today. That's what you're saying.
Yeah, absolutely. There's enough out there now, and customers have got a certain expectation of what a good journey should and can and often does look like. So it's about putting that back into their hands.
And Amanda, how does that sort of affect customer trust? I mean, what's the trust angle here? that organizations need to be thinking about?
Giles, it's an interesting question. I think it's actually an opportunity to win trust. Our work with organizations like Atoll and our research and studies into ways to improve consumer trust shows that responding well to issues and challenges can make a real difference in how consumers perceive you. So it's important, just as Darren and David has been saying all along, it's important to respond and respond well, to use the technology that's there and try to provide the best possible experience for the consumers, either through the complaints process, which is, as you mentioned, is one outcomes, or the full redress outcome, if that's the case. It's about keeping it quick and simple. It's about encouraging self-serve, and it's also about leaving room to respond to the more complex edge cases and those consumers that might need more assistance. So, truly inclusive service. And that's where you can kind of, as David said, you don't necessarily need to respond to bums on seats and have loads and loads of people. You drive people through self-service, and then you have humans to deal with those edge cases and more complex ones. And that way you can demonstrate that you've really dealt with the issues quickly, fairly, and ethically, and leaving a good and leaving consumers feeling like they've had a good response to this issue.
I think that's a remarkable insight, that actually when people are experiencing challenges, that ends up being an opportunity to win trust, and it chimes with the stories that people share, right? That when they talk about the organizations that have treated them well, very often it begins with, there was a problem and they dealt with it well.
Yes, I agree.
And so David, Gary, if we're thinking then about automating services, if we're thinking about creating innovative services that are easy for consumers to use, what's the data angle on that? Because this is a complicated space, I imagine.
Yeah, it sure is, Giles, and David spoke about the traditional ops model playbook, that is the scale for these type of seismic regulatory changes, essentially more people to deal with it. But automation AI really represents an opportunity to pivot that model. But first, you need to understand the lifeblood of your company, your data. So companies can do this by asking themselves some key questions. Do you know where your customers are? What data points do you need to capture? Do you need to understand the credit agreement, the DCA agreement between the finance provider and the dealership? What were the pricing policies at the time of the arrangement? What's the transaction history for each client? What's the current addresses? So the state of this historical data will provide challenges, whether it's structured or unstructured. Do you have physical paper documents in storage somewhere? Then how do you bring this data together so you can better understand it? Then how do you deal with the influx of scaling to meet demand without impacting your normal services? Is your data science team going to be redeployed to deal with all of these cases? How do you effectively report on delivery of your remediation? And then how do you do it faster by leveraging automation and AI to help you? So the key is to address your critical data challenges now: inconsistent data, incomplete records, historical data issues. You might have data siloed across different systems within your organization. And how are you going to deal with this large volume of data set efficiently? So companies need to get an understanding of their data now, identify early their level of exposure, be on the front foot, keep their reputation intact, address those customer perceptions, and keeping an eye on maintaining your current levels of service.
And again, that's going to be that need to kind of join up data that might be spread between the lender and the broker to figure out what to do with data that's not in a machine readable form, not being stored in a digital form. Those challenges come into play whether there's a complaints solution or whether there's a remediation solution, right?
Massively, and there's obviously tools in the industry that can help with that. And you identified a really good challenge as well, actually, is that data from external sources that's outside the control of the particular company and organization. So how do you integrate and source those data from third parties?
Yeah, and working across those organizational boundaries is inherent in this challenge. And I guess Amanda, you were talking about trust, and the consumer will be judging not only the lender but also the broker, and I imagine that's a challenge for the brokers as well, is that they want to know that the lender's got their back almost.
Yes, and I think that's where, sorry, I didn't know if you were addressing that to me, Giles, but yes, and I think that's where my lens of that kind of customer experience and Gary's lens of data really comes into play, of making sure that we understand the context of use and the data and where it sits.
So there's a lot to untangle, but what should people do now? What are the no regrets moves, something that will have value no matter what the future holds, or the must do things that people need to be preparing for? And I wonder, first of all, thinking about boards and senior leadership and governance, what's your response to that, Darren?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing I'd point out there, Giles, is probably reference to the CEO letter that the FCA issued in April, which pointed out to firms that whilst the FCA had seen and heard that firms were taking very different approaches when accounting for the potential impact of the DCA issue on their financial resources, and reminding firms that whilst each firm is going to be different, will have its own individual issues and nuances, that it expects all firms to plan for any additional operational costs and for the for the increased complaints, and to be able to meet the costs of those redress. So firms should be undertaking an assessment of the adequacy of their financial resources, thinking about the risks and potential liabilities that the firm is exposed to, including any potential redress liabilities going forward. Accountancy standards generally require firms to make provisions or recognise contingent liabilities in their financial statements for liabilities of uncertain timing or amounts. The FCA also pointed out in their letter that it requires firms to immediately notify it if it foresees any challenges or risks in maintaining adequate financial resources. So definitely firms need to do the right amount of assessment, need to think about how they're going to model the sort of worst case and plausible scenarios that might come off the back of this, and do their assessments, and the boards obviously need to be very, very aware of that and driving that through in a reasonable time frame if they've not done so already. There's already been some media coverage of some larger firms making some reasonably hefty contingency for the potential liabilities. So any firm that ignores that is at risk of getting into a bit of difficulty with the FCA, I would expect.
Yeah, and obviously boards have to make sure that the plan is in place to keep the organisation safe in all situations. What about from an operational point of view then? David, what would you say the no regrets or the must do moves are that organisations should be taking right now?
Thanks, Giles. I think from an operational point of view, and this goes alongside all of the other stuff and the things that Darren was just talking about, but one of the first things to do is to create a key point of contact to manage this. And I don't think it necessarily has to be an all singing program team at this point, although some people will be getting there with that. But that contact essentially needs to be there to provide structure and direction, and be able to adapt and respond if and when required. So I think that's the first thing. And then the next thing I think that's really important is understanding what existing and internal capability and capacity you've got to deal with that. So, asking yourself the questions like, do you have processes in place already? Do you have centralized or in-house complaints functions that can pick this up? And as Gary's already said, use the data available, use the data to understand the size and scale of the issue, or the potential size and scale of the issue, and determine whether that is something that can be absorbed from an operational perspective, or whether, you know, the support will be needed from elsewhere. So a lot of what we're talking about here is minimising and managing the impact on BAU. So naturally, the first step is to understand what that would be. So again, I think Darren's alluded to this as well. There's a balance between doing not a lot and doing too much at this stage with the amount of uncertainty. But when we use the data to our advantage, I think we can find that balance. And I think the only other thing I think to think about is to engage with as many stakeholders as possible. There'll be many actors involved here, as I've said, so it's important to identify them early on. Think through the entire business chain and the whole group of business processes that might be impacted, not necessarily just complaints, and work through what that impact looks like and how you might be able to or need to manage that. Thanks.
And we've said that that we think good looks like a kind of a highly automated, super easy to use self-service pathway for most people through this. But how can you be ready for that when you don't know what the pathway is? I mean, what's the customer angle on this, and how can you be ready to fulfill their expectations, Amanda?
It's a good question, Giles, because, you know, as I mentioned before, you want to provide the best possible experience for consumers, but you don't want to over-design or over-engineer a solution when the outcome of the FCA review is not yet clear. So I think you want to start by understanding the context of the consumers. So there is a lot of press out there, a lot of advice already. So what are they seeing, hearing, absorbing now? And also then modeling what their expectations are of the different scenarios and outcomes so that you're prepared for it. You also want to know that context so you can make the self-serve work, right? You want the highly automated, less reliant on big call centers and contact centers model to work. So you need that digital service to really reflect the consumer's needs and context. And operational, it's just, I think it's about that prep, about understanding your consumers, you know, maybe modeling, you know, if it's dealing with a backlog of complaints, what does that look like versus dealing with redress and remediation? And then you can react, learn, and iterate as you ramp up the services to meet the outcomes of the FCA review.
See, thank you. And I'm finding from a data point of view, then Gary, how can people get ready for that, and what are the no regrets or the must-do moves in your opinion?
So for me, the main things clients should be thinking about from a data perspective are innovate to identify, analyze to predict, and accelerate your model. So just to break that down a little bit, innovate to identify is really about understanding where your data resides and assessing its lineage. By doing a sort of deep data discovery, you'll really understand your data sources, the systems, and you'll be able to create clear measures of your organization's data landscape. You can, of course, use AI-driven data inventory tools to help you scan and catalog existing data sources, both for physical documents and unstructured digital files. Then analyze, predict is very much about cleaning and sorting out your data. Again, this can be accelerated with an AI data assessment tooling that'll minimize the impact of data duplications, omission errors, and ultimately reducing the workload of your support staff dealing with this. Then get your data into that central repository. What platforms do you have in-house? Are you able to leverage big data technologies to allow for scalability of storage and processing power to deal with the volume that you might be facing? You know, ultimately all of this will get to the point where you'll have a joined up set view of your siloed data. You'll be able to reveal new insights, answer key questions around caseload metrics, customer demographics, etc. It's the blueprint of your organization's data that creates that single source of truth. So the right stakeholders have the right information with a consistent view for all your claim and complaint handlers. Then you can get on the front foot, anticipate the level of exposure, to scale your preparations for your model. So if you take a sample data set, you can develop a predictive analytics model that allow you to do that forecasting. And the final step, accelerate your model. So that's about analysing, processing your data. You can do that more effectively and more efficiently with automated decision-making tools for maybe low-risk cases around complaints and redress. And finally, visualising the organisation's data more simply. Complex information, but make it easier to communicate to your key stakeholders using dashboards and reporting to make sure that you're in line with compliance. So you've already transferred large volumes of data items into one cohesive data set. Now it's about developing the performance metrics so we can properly assess the efficiency and the effectiveness and the quality of your remediation activities. For example, a dashboard will allow you to see at a glance how a caseload and expenditure compares with expected values, enables clear reporting on progress, trends, projecting long-term success, and even understanding the impact of different FCA rulings. So regardless of the FCA ruling, these are definitely the no-regret moves. Create a mature data ecosystem, demystify your current data, gives you a clear picture and scope of the magnitude of the potential claims, and allow you to optimize your ability to deal with large-scale events like this impending FCA ruling.
Fantastic, thank you. So we're now ready to go to questions from the audience, and as we've been talking, I've been interested to understand. First of all, is it really the case that all DCAs had a negative impact on customers? We've been saying we think that it's going to land somewhere in the middle. Darren, is there any consensus around that?
I mean, I definitely think it's not the case that they all had a negative impact. I mean, I've had plenty of conversations with frustrated finance providers who point to many occasions in the past where that discretionary element allowed brokers to reduce the amount of commission in order to secure a sale. So there's been several people who've been very keen to point out that type of scenario to me, and on the basis that I think most reasonable people would agree that a level of commission was reasonable for brokers to take to set up those finance arrangements for customers, then in many cases brokers were giving up certainly what would be considered to be an unreasonable amount above that commission, but even going into that what it would be a reasonable amount. So absolutely not. I don't think all DCAs had a negative impact on customers.
No, it sounds like some of them may even have benefited customers.
Exactly, yes.
Yeah. Some of the things we've been hearing from people also, it's frustrating when something very disconnected from my day-to-day suddenly has a big impact on me. Don't even know kind of where to begin to get started with this. And I wonder, if you're in the middle of all of that confusion and you're trying to think about, okay, well, how do I get board approval to take some sort of action? How do you convince them that now is the time to prepare, David?
I just think it's a case of knowing that what those must-do actions are. There are certain things you can do now that won't do you any harm. There are certain things that firms should be doing anyway to protect themselves and to really get a view of what they're doing. And it's things like evidencing the need for understanding data, understanding the capacity and capability that you've got, understanding what currently exists across the operation that could be impacted by this. And it's not necessarily the risk of doing it, it's what the risk of not doing this is. So I think that's it. And it's, as I've already said, it's finding the balance between not doing very much and doing, making sure you've got your ducks in a row.
So it's about not overreacting, but doing just enough to keep.
Absolutely that, yeah.
Yeah.
I'd add to that, Giles. I mean, I think most of the conversations I've had is data is key here. Data is king. I mean, I think what we heard around the skilled person work with the FCA, for example, was that work was slightly delayed because firms were struggling to obtain all of the data for the sample selected by the FCA skilled person. Particularly when you think about the time period that review is looking at, 2007 through to 21, it's a long period of time. potentially multiple system changes, potentially large pools of different dealerships that are finance providers dealing with. So, you know, it really is a potentially huge challenge for firms to grapple with, and taking steps now to try and understand what their data challenges are and start putting in some using some neat tools to try and read and all of that kind of stuff. I think is absolutely essential, and it's definitely, for me, is at the top of the no regrets list.
It's just that a complexity of the data landscape. Sorry, Gary.
Yeah, I was just going to build on that. It's a really good point, Darren. And if you ask most CDOs, that said that they'd want to clean and sort the data and have a holistic view and a common view of all their data set, regardless of this FCA ruling or another. So this could be a real catalyst for organisations to use that as a springboard to finally sort their data and give them and unlock the value and harness the potential value of it within the organisation.
We've mentioned the spectre of PPI and something that drags on for years, and I know we've been asked about that in the questions, and Darren, you said that something that both the regulator and the industry are keen to set up the future to avoid. But I wonder about a more pressing concern. I mean, once the FCA has made its ruling, then presumably there will be this backlog of complaints that normally you'd expect to be treated within sort of 8 weeks, I think is the requirement. Does that mean that suddenly people are going to be expected to handle all of those in 8 weeks on top of everything else?
I mean, I think that there's been nothing said by the FCA that suggests that wouldn't be the case, but I agree with your concern as to how realistic that is. I mean, for some of the bigger organisations, you'll be looking at, I would imagine by that stage, certainly hundreds of thousands, if not maybe one or two of them, getting up towards 1 million or beyond. So, you know, is it really feasible for that organisation to respond to that sort of volume of complaints in a few weeks? I would suggest not. So I'll be keen to listen to what the FCA's got to say about that if it goes down the route of just simply lifting the pause again. I think that the volume of potential claims here, I think the relatively recent memory of PPI might be a reason why the FCA go down the redress scheme route, just to create some certainty, some consistency, and potentially have a bit more control about timeframes around it as well. I would imagine that the FCA and frankly the whole industry will be keen to whatever the route forward is to do it in as quickly and as efficient way as possible and put it in the rearview mirror.
Thank you. So, in spite of all of that complexity that's out there and uncertainty that's out there, I think today we've identified some points of certainty, some things that organisations can definitely do to set themselves up and be ready for whatever comes ahead. I just wonder if there's one action that you could recommend that people do from today. I wonder what that would be. And that last question, David, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Charles. I think it's already been said, but I think that is understanding your data, understanding that you know your potential exposure, pulling all of the different sources together, really getting an understanding of where you're currently at and where your data resides, all of those things that Gary's already spoken about. So yeah, there's a lot of uncertainty at the minute. It's a complicated situation. There's a bit of emotion in there too, particularly with customers who feel they've been misled. So you know, there's a real need for data governance set up, ultimately all to ensure that you know that there's a customer focus on this at the end, and whatever happens, regardless of the outcome of the investigation, that you know customers have that best possible journey and experience through all of it. But for me, number one, the key at the minute is to you know get the data strategy and governance set up.
Here.
Fantastic. You know, thank you all very much. That really has helped to shed some light on a complicated problem. and provide some good guidance for the days ahead. It only remains for me then to say thank you to you, our panelists, and also to our audience for listening and for their questions. If you'd like to get in touch with us here at Sopra Next and understand more about some of the problems and paths that we've raised, then please do get in touch. And we'll be returning, I'm sure, later on in the year with an update and further thoughts as the situation evolves. Thank you.
Driving meaningful impact. Sopra Next.